Thank you all for being here. I'm Gloria Palmer, the Executive Director of Green Mountain Academy for Lifelong Learning. It's an absolute thrill, I think, for me to be offering this program. It's unique in that we have a speaker who's presenting from France. Today's presenter is Pamela Morton. She is an artist and university teacher who has been living and working in the south of France for over 30 years. An expert on Provence and the artists of the South, she has organized and led museum and site visits for cultural organizations and college students. She lectures on Picasso and Matisse, as well as on Cezanne and Van Gogh. She has also taught painting and drawing along with 19th and 20th century art history courses for study abroad programs. And with a background that includes art restoration and museum education, Pamela brings special insight to her understanding of artistic works and their settings, both in time and place. Like the artists she studies and admires, Pamela finds inspiration for her own work with the bold light and landscapes of the south of France. It's an absolute delight to have you with us here today, Pamela Morton. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you. I'm so happy to be here. Hello, everybody. All right. Can I go ahead then and bring up my slides? Yes. Hello and welcome. Again, I'm Pamela Morton, and I'm talking to you from the south of France, where I've been living for 30 years. And tonight I want to talk to you about, well, I know it's daytime for you. It's just a little after 8 in the evening for me. So I want to talk about Paul Cezanne today. And then next week, I'll talk about Van Gogh. And then after that, I'll talk about Matisse. So let me bring up my first slide. Okay, here's our man, Paul Cezanne, who was born in 1839, dies in 1906. So he was 67 years old when he died. And he spends most of his life, most of his working life in and around Aix-en-Provence, where he was born and where he died. And my map shows you Provence. So you can see in the little inset, here's France, and Provence is this southeast corner. It's about the size of the state of Maryland. And Provence is both a geographic region and a historic region. It's defined by the Alps on the east side, which come down from the north towards the Mediterranean. And of course, this is the border between France and Italy right here. And then on the other side, it's defined by the Rhone River. So the second biggest city in France is Marseille. And here's Marseille. Can you see my little arrow here? Right on the coast. And Aix-en-Provence, where I'm speaking to you from today, is just north of Marseille. It's about a half an hour drive north. So this is where Cezanne spent most of his time. And by the way, on Thursday, we'll be talking about Van Gogh and Arles, and he is not far at all from Aix-en-Provence, over on the Rhone River just here. So Cezanne is born in Aix, and his first initiation in terms of art has to do with a local drawing school that's connected with the local museum here in Aix. And the way that artists worked in the old days is by copying the works of masters. And in fact, he knew the collection in our local museum, which is called the Musée Granet, so called because of an artist from a previous generation named Granet, who's been eclipsed by Cezanne. But Granet left his collection to Aix, the city of Aix, and so the museum has his name. Here are two early works by Cezanne. The one that you can see over on the left, he did when he was about 20 years old, and the one on the right, about 22. The one over on the left, this is a very close copy of a painting in the museum called Kiss of the Muse. And I sometimes think that Cezanne picked this painting to copy because he was looking for inspiration. He was hoping for the kiss of the muse. And if you're familiar with Cezanne's work, and you look at this painting, you probably never would have guessed it was by Cezanne because it's so different from what he does later on. So the way you worked was you did copies after paintings, you did copies after the sculpture collection in the museum, and the sculpture collection was mostly plaster casts after Greco-Roman sculpture. And then if all that went well, you graduated and you actually worked from the live model. And so here is one of Cezanne's nude studies, life drawings from this very early period. This is how he starts off. And here's another painting, in fact, 4 panels that you can see over on the left, which again are so surprising. They don't look at all like what Cezanne did later on. And these 4 panels, these are allegorical figures representing the different season. And he did these paintings for his father's house. And he signed his work, but not with his own name and not with the actual date that he made these paintings. Okay, the paintings were done in 1860, 61. So again, he's about 20, 21 years old. And he signs them Ang 1811. Okay, he wasn't born, Cezanne wasn't around in 1811. And Ang is the name of a very important artist in France. And you can see an example of his work on the right. In fact, our little local museum is very lucky to have this painting because it's by a very important artist from the 19th century. In fact, it's this artist, Ang, who ran the show in the 19th century. And have a look at this painting. It's called Jupiter and Thetis. So it makes reference to mythology. And this is what painting was supposed to do. It was supposed to be about scenes from the Bible, scenes from mythology, or great events in the past. And also you can see it's done in a very detailed way. And it's very clear. There's a kind of legibility here. Everything is carefully drawn and then filled in, and so the story becomes clear. This is actually an episode from the Trojan Wars, and Thetis was a sea nymph, and she goes to Jupiter, head god, and says, "Please protect my son, whose name was Achilles." And you probably know that Achilles had a weak point, his ankle, because he was dipped in sort of magic potion to protect everything but his ankle where he was dipped. And the woman floating in on a cloud here, this is Jupiter's wife, Juno, who is very jealous. And so she's keeping an eye on what's going on here. Anyway, this painting is an enormous painting. And when I take my students to the local museum to see the painting, I always tell them to get up close. And I ask them if they can see any brushwork. No. Impossible, because that's the whole point of this type of painting. It's about craftsmanship, and the brushwork is invisible because Ang worked with a very small brush, and there's very subtle gradation from darks to light. So this is the kind of painting that all our artists were up against in the 19th century. This is official French painting. The Impressionists were up against this, Cezanne, Van Gogh, and even Matisse and Picasso to a large extent. And Ang had a long life, so he really ruled the roost. And in fact, to make that point, I'll tell you that he picked all the artists who taught in the official art school up in Paris. He picked all the jurors who decided who got to have scholarships and study in Rome. So he really had a stranglehold on art. And that's probably why Cezanne signed his name. It was a little bit tongue-in-cheek because anybody in the 19th century had to acknowledge Ang. And most artists, at least all these modern artists, the avant-garde, hated him because of the kind of control he had. But at the same time, they had to acknowledge his ability. So he was a wonderful draftsman. Now, here are the 4 paintings you can see in my black and white photo, organized in Cezanne's house, the family house. And here is a photograph of the house, which is just on the edge of the city of Aix-en-Provence. They're doing some restoration work, and hopefully by the time you get a chance to come here and visit, it'll be open again to the public. This property was purchased by Cezanne's father. Cezanne's father started off in the hat business, and he did well in the hat business, and he eventually bought the only bank in town, and in this way became a very wealthy man. And this is important to our Cezanne story because he supported his son. Now, he wasn't happy with his son's choice about becoming an artist, and the allowance he gave him was very small, but it was enough for Cezanne to continue to pursue his dream of becoming an artist. Cezanne had a very complicated relationship with his father, a difficult relationship. And I think some of that comes through in this portrait he did of him. Again, this style here that he's working in is so different from the later style of Cezanne. And notice how Cezanne is positioned as his father. He's in profile view, maybe because Cezanne didn't want to have to deal with him face to face. And what's quite interesting about the portraits that Cezanne did of his father, in every portrait, he's wearing a different hat. And that's because the father saved a sample from every collection they produced in the hat shop. And so he would wear a different hat for every painting. And here he is reading the newspaper. But look at the way Cezanne's presented him, how the way he fills up the picture space here. He looks like a force to be reckoned with. And indeed, that's what he was. In fact, sometimes I think he looks monumental and like a mountain. And that might ring a little bell for you because Cezanne did a lot of paintings of the mountain that's very close to Aix-en-Provence, which we'll look at later. And look at the arrangement of the panels, the decorative panels, the four seasons in the house, and like a kind of Jupiter figure, it's the portrait of the father that's in the middle here in a very commanding position. An important figure in Cezanne's life, apart from his father, was his best friend, Émile Zola. Émile Zola became a very important figure in the literary scene in the 19th century in France. And Zola and Cezanne met when they were in school, when Zola was 12 and Cezanne was 13. In fact, the Zola family came down to the south of France because the father was an engineer. And Aix, close to Marseille, they were looking to bring more water to these cities, plus there'd been cholera epidemics. So he was responsible for a whole system of dams and locks and waterways. In fact, just between the city of Aix and the mountain that Cezanne so often painted, there's a dam called Zola Dam. And in fact, this was the boys' introduction to a landscape that both of them immortalized later, one in painting and one in literature. In fact, here's a little letter that Cezanne sent to Zola, and it shows the boys out in the countryside playing in the water where they used to like to hunt and fish. They were part of a little circle of friends called the Inseparables. So they were good friends. And the story goes, when they met, Zola was being picked on by the other boys because he had a Parisian accent. And Cezanne defended him. And the story goes that Zola, to thank Cezanne, gave him a basket of apples. And some people say this is why Cezanne so often painted apples in his work later on. And here's something else interesting about the two young boys together in school. Do you know that it was Zola that got all the prizes for art and Cezanne that got all the prizes for literature when they were students? So this tells you why they became such fast friends, because they had these two interests in common. Zola, by the way, not only became a novelist, he was also a journalist, he was a critic, he wrote essays about art. And this is a portrait of him done by an artist named Manet to thank Zola, because Zola, for a while, championed this new group of artists, Manet and then the Impressionists, including his friend Cezanne. This is a portrait of Zola done by Cezanne. Well, actually, at the end of their high school years, the two friends are separated because Zola's father has died. Zola's mother decides to take the family back to Paris, where she had the support of family and friends. And that's when this important correspondence begins between the two friends. And Zola's up in Paris. He's interested in art, and he's seeing all sorts of new things that are going on. And he writes his friend back in X. He says, listen, if you're serious about becoming an artist, you have to come up to Paris. Cezanne, afraid of dealing with his father, sort of dragged his feet, and Zola kept on him. And then finally, Cezanne took a stand with his father, said, I want to be an artist. I want to go up to Paris. But because he had been pushed into going to law school by his father, because his father was interested in having his son protect his interests. But finally, the father relented. Cezanne goes up to Paris. The two friends find each other, and they go off to discover all the new things that are going on in art. Cezanne gets permission to make copies in the Louvre. He makes a copy of this artist, Poussin, and this might remind you of the Ingres painting of Jupiter and Thetis that we saw a moment ago, and that's exactly right, because Ingres modeled himself after this 17th century painter. So these artists were all part of official French art. These were all academic artists. But then soon, Cezanne discovers another artist working the same time as Ingres, but working in a very different style, named Delacroix. And he liked Delacroix because, different from the coolness of academic art, kind of intellectual coolness and the linear quality, here's something very melodramatic with a warm, hot palette. And in fact, this is the story of an Assyrian monarch whose kingdom is besieged. And so he orders all his possessions brought to him, including the women in the harem and horses, and they're all killed. And they all go up in a big funeral pyre, including the king. This is the kind of melodramatic subject matter that interested Zola and Cezanne at the beginning. And in fact, here are two other early examples of Cezanne's work, once again, very different from what we're familiar with. And we see this sort of strange, muscular figure going off into the countryside with a wan female figure. And over here, a scene called The Murder. Even the titles of Cezanne's paintings are a clue. The Murder, The Strangled Woman, The Autopsy, they're all on this kind of subject. And so these are all paintings done from his imagination. This changes after Zola and Cezanne in Paris discover the work of a younger artist, a more recent artist named Courbet. And Courbet said, I'm not going to paint like Ingres or Poussin. I'm not going to paint like Delacroix. Both of them just paint these fantasies. These are allegories. And Courbet said, I'm only going to paint what I know for myself, what I can understand through my own senses. And he called himself a realist. And this is one of his paintings. He painted from life. And here is a painting by Cezanne. You can see he's making reference to the Courbet figure over on the left. And here's another painting in the little local museum here in Aix that Cezanne did. And Courbet, interested in real life, actually approached his painting like a sculptor, building up the surfaces of the objects and figures in his paintings. And that's exactly what Cezanne has done here. And this is a departure for him, because he's not painting these crazy stories from his imagination, but he's now painting from something he sees. But you could see the thick buildup of paint. So he's working in a style like Courbet. And over on the right, this is another portrait of Cezanne's father. And he shows his father wearing a different hat this time and reading a paper, a newspaper. And this time he's made it very clear to us which paper the father is reading. It's called L'Événement. And this is a newspaper that Cezanne's father wouldn't be caught dead reading, because it was the left-wing radical paper, but it was the paper for which Zola wrote his articles about art and about his friend Cezanne. So here we have a painting. It's a kind of manifesto, as you can see. It's Cezanne's painting of his father reading about him in a newspaper. And notice he's hung the little still life we've been looking at over on the left over his father's head. Notice the chair here. Same chair in another painting by Cezanne's. And Cezanne was very much the rebel at the beginning of his career while he was up in Paris. In fact, this is a portrait that he submitted to the official exhibition in Paris, which, by the way, was rejected. And not surprisingly, when you consider that the painting over on the right was the painting that was given the prize that year. And it was rejected because you can see it looks sort of unfinished. It's kind of raw. It's very expressive. It doesn't have the kind of clarity and detail like this one. This is another painting by Ingres, this time of Napoleon I. And in fact, Cezanne's actually even thumbing his nose at this painting because this portrait of a friend of his who had the wonderful name of Achille, Empereur, which is a kind of like emperor. So instead of Napoleon on his throne, he's put his friend, a little local artist, on a kind of throne, except his feet don't touch the ground because they're on a little foot warmer. And here are his long johns peeking out from his bathrobe, a little bit different from the Napoleon one. Well, look, here's a caricature that appeared in the newspaper making fun of Cezanne and the two submissions that Cezanne made to the official exhibition in Paris. One was a nude study. We don't know anything about it because the painting's been lost, but the other one was the portrait of his friend from Aix, a colleague, fellow painter. And look at the way Cezanne is portrayed here in this cartoon as a kind of country bumpkin. That's how he was perceived. And there was an article that went with this cartoon, and the article begins, "Okay, to all of you who paint with a broom and other such article, I've just met your match. I've met Paul Cezanne." So that was this journalist's take, was that Cezanne painted with a broom. But Cezanne holds his own. He says in the article, he's quoted as saying, "I paint what I feel, monsieur, and I have strong feelings." So that was his way of explaining this kind of very thick brushwork and expressive brushwork and expressive colors. His friend from Aix, this literally little man, because he was a dwarf, went to visit Cezanne up in Paris, and he found Cezanne in a bad mood. Cezanne was living across from the wharfs. And this is a painting that Cezanne did from his window. And you could see they were rolling wine barrels up and down all day. So the noise was deafening. That didn't help Cezanne's mood. Plus, Cezanne had just met a woman named Hortense in 1869. And in 1872, they had a son. Cezanne didn't want his father to know about this relationship, or even the existence of his son, because he was afraid that his father would take away this little allowance that he needed to survive, because the woman he came involved with was not from the right side of the tracks. She was an artist model, so he kept this a secret. Well, Cezanne did not want to return to Aix because he did not want his father to know about this new relationship and his son. But a solution was found. Cezanne made the acquaintance of another artist named Pissarro in French, or Pissarro, we sometimes say in English. Pissarro was a member of the Impressionist group. In fact, he's one in the group that helped organize these exhibitions of the Impressionists. The Impressionists couldn't show in the official exhibitions either, because again, their work didn't look like Jupiter and Thetis. So they organized their own exhibitions, 8 in all. The first one was in 1874. Cezanne showed in their first exhibition, not in their second, and then in their third exhibition, but never showed again. And part of that was because people made such fun of Impressionism, and the one they made the most fun of was Cezanne. This is Pissarro's portrait of Cezanne, and this is Cezanne's self-portrait here. Cezanne wanted to be back in Aix, but couldn't go. Pizarro said to him, I live outside of Aix. I live in a little village called, he was in Pontoise and also in Auvers. Bring Hortense, bring your son, and you can live with us. And this is what he did. And it's from Pizarro that Cezanne learns about Impressionism. And you look at these two, these depictions of Cezanne here, sort of a woolly, rebellious figure here. And in Pizarro's portrait of Cezanne, a cartoon of Corb, who was very happy with this portrait he had done of Cezanne because he was sure that his pupil was going to amount to something big, and he kept this painting with him all his life. And just to remind you all, here is the example of Impressionism, this iconic work by Monet. This is the painting that gave the movement its name. And you probably know the story that Monet wanted to put this in the first exhibit. This was these independent shows that they organized. And they said to Monet, well, what name should we give this painting for our catalog? And he said, well, we can't really call it the harbor of Le Havre, because it's not really about that. It's about the atmosphere of the sunrise over this port. And he said, let's call it Impression Sunrise. And of course, the name stuck, although originally it was taken to mean impression in the sense that it looked unfinished. It looked like sloppy workmanship, because it doesn't have the kind of detail and precision that most painting of this time did. Cezanne and Pizarro worked side by side. And I must say, even though Pizarro's a little bit older than Cezanne, Pizarro ended up learning as much from Cezanne as Cezanne did from Pizarro. Here are two paintings, the one on the left by Cezanne, the one on the right by Pizarro. And you can see they're similar subject matter, but they're so different. And of course, this difference is going to become more pronounced. Pizarro's painting, I would say, is much more picturesque. There's something sort of charming about this scene. Whereas in Cezanne's, there's something dense and heavy. And the way these buildings are all kind of pushed together. This was Cezanne's first submission to the first Impressionist show. And of course, he got panned for this. Here are two more examples, Cezanne on the left, Pizarro on the right. Again, superficially similar, but again, quite different. I would say that Pizarro's on the right is much more atmospheric. It's softer. How there's this play of light. Look at the way the trees frame this view of the houses in the distance. Cezanne's painting also has houses and trees, but everything seems to be pushed up to the foreground. We don't have that same feeling of space. And the treatment here, the whole painting is much more structured. There's an emphasis on geometry that's different from the Pizarro. Cezanne, spending time at the beginning with the Impressionists outside of Paris. Of course, he wants to return to Aix. He misses Aix. He doesn't like Paris. He doesn't like the big city, the noise, the commotion, the pollution. He doesn't like a lot of the artists like Manet and Degas. He doesn't like the way the Impressionists, once the sun goes down, put down their brushes and gather in cafes and have these heated discussions about art. He doesn't like any of this, and he misses Aix. He's able to return to Aix because his mother has rented a house near Marseille on the sea. So he doesn't have to go to Aix, he can go to Marseille. And this is a painting he does there. And I think you can see Impressionism here in the treatment of the leaves. There's a kind of sort of shimmering effect, little touches of the brush to create this movement, maybe through the leaves here. But then there's something different happening with, once again, the geometry of the buildings and smokestacks. Once back in the South, Cezanne writes a letter to Pizarro. He wants Pizarro to come and join him in the South. And he says to Pizarro, he says, this is how he describes the South. It's like a playing card, red roofs against the blue sea. And what he's referring to is like a queen of hearts or a jack of diamonds. He says there's this kind of strong colors and a kind of graphic quality. And all this has to do with the sun, that in the North, everything is kind of fuzzy. And the artists of the North, the Impressionists, are interested in this play of light. They're interested not in things in and of themselves, but in what the French call the envelope, the surrounding air and atmosphere. Cezanne, taught by the Impressionists to be true to what he sees, when he comes down to the South, he notices in this different weather, different climate, different light, that the light picks out objects and forms. And now we're going to see this shift where he moves away from Impressionism, a kind of return to structure and an interest in composition, an emphasis on geometry, but two things he's going to keep from Impressionism: working out of doors, en plein air, and also a lighter, brighter, more vivid palette, not the heavy blacks and grays that we saw from that very earlier period. This is a painting on a subject that interests Cezanne throughout his life. In fact, Cezanne is also different than the Impressionists because the Impressionists tended to focus primarily on landscape. Renoir did a lot of portraiture, portraits and landscape. Monet did almost exclusively landscapes, but Cezanne painted still lifes, landscapes, portraiture, and also work from his imagination. And a theme, the bathers, is just that. Now, this makes reference to the landscape of the South because we've got this mountain that he's going to paint over and over. The colors are bright and fresh, like Impressionism, but look at these figures and notice the poses. These figures are very statuesque, a kind of monumental. In fact, he's not working from actual figures. These figures are based on sketches he did after classical sculpture he saw in the Louvre. So it's a mix of memory and what he actually sees. So what he knows and what he sees. Again, you can see the progression in his work, something very impressionistic here. And then we move from this, and even though it's a still life composition, it's quite different from, for example, Pizarro. Look at the way he's set up these objects here, sort of aligned, stressing the verticals here, and over with the basket, all the circles. In fact, notice he's put two paintings on the wall behind, and how the paintings behind kind of reiterate the qualities in the foreground, the verticality here and the sort of rounded forms here. And here's one of his paintings, many paintings of apples. So we have just an interesting kind of pure form, the spherical forms of the apples. Cezanne and Monet and Renoir all started off as starving artists. But Renoir and Monet, come the 1880s, they're doing quite well for themselves. Cezanne, not so much. In fact, in the 1880s, a Renoir or a Monet painting would sell for between 3,000 and 4,000 francs. In the same period, a Cezanne painting would only sell for between 300 and 400 francs. So you can see that's a huge difference in terms of how these artists are valued and perceived. But Cezanne is lucky because he's good friends with Monet and Renoir introduced him to a man named Victor Choquet, who was a kind of bureaucrat. He worked in the customs office, but he was interested in modern art, collected Monet, collected Renoir, and began to collect Cezanne. So Cezanne had a few loyal collectors. And don't forget, he also had this money from his father, even though it wasn't much. But again, an interesting comparison, Renoir versus Cezanne. Cezanne's painting is so expressive. It looks almost like El Greco. It always reminds me of El Greco. And the figure is sort of very monumental, the way he fills up the space. The brushwork is very visible. A critic who didn't like this painting said that the figure looked like it was molded out of chocolate. And the Renoir painting is more traditional. It doesn't have that same sort of tension. It's sort of more charming, more soft. This is a portrait that Cezanne did of Hortense. And it's kind of in an impressionistic style because you can see all the touches of the brush here. But again, there's something strange that happens with the space. Now we have a figure, a chair, and a background, but we don't really read the distance over her lap. It's almost like a collage that her figure has been cut out and pasted on this red shape. The red shape has been cut out and pasted on the wallpaper. Do you see that? There's a kind of flatness here, which gives it a kind of abstract look and a modern look. And maybe it has to do with the sort of distant look of the face here too. This painting, at first glance, you might say, oh yes, I can see a connection with Impressionism, again, because of the movement in the foliage, this wonderful sort of dappled light. But then look at the way he's treated the bridge. So there's a real emphasis on the horizontal of the bridge. And notice how he's used the reflection of the support of the bridge to create the circular shape here. And even this tree creates a vertical, so it has this structure that is lacking in Impressionism. Here is a self-portrait that Cezanne did, and now he's really come into his own. This is his mature style. We can see the influence of Impressionism here when you look at the head here. Notice the brushwork, very visible. That's an idea that comes from Impressionism. Also, it seems as with every touch of the brush, there's a different color. Look at the range of colors here. Pinks, blues, greens, yellows, peach colors, salmons. So instead of making a kind of monolithic beige color, flesh color on the palette, he's let all these colors kind of blend in our eye. So those are two things from Impressionism. But what's new and different here is his emphasis on form. Look at how clearly defined his head here is. There's nothing sort of fuzzy here. It's an oval. And then notice what he's done with the wallpaper design behind his head. In fact, here's something interesting about Cezanne's work. The background is never just a backdrop against which he places people or objects. It's always an integral part of the painting. Let me show you what I mean. Okay, so he's used the wallpaper to kind of frame his head. So it's almost like a circle inside a square. See the diamond shape here? And notice how he suppressed certain elements in the wallpaper design to have more of that effect. So we go from 1 up 2, across 3, and then come down, and you see roughly where a 4th one would fall is where his ear is. And notice how his ear looks something like that diamond shape in the wallpaper. Now, this is Cezanne's interest, that everything in a painting was of equal interest. It wasn't about a figure in a background. Everything had a kind of importance, and everything had to work together. This is Cezanne's son. As I mentioned, Hortense and Cezanne had a son whom they named Paul. So here is Paul Jr. Cezanne had a very close relationship with his son. And I think the closeness comes through here, not so much in the expression of the face, but the way he's kind of honed in on the boys. So it has that kind of immediacy and directness, like a snapshot. And also notice that in doing this, there's some sort of ambiguity. Like the boy must have been sitting on the arm of an armchair, because the way he's framed it, we see the boy over to one side of the chair. And you can see how Cezanne has gotten interested in the shape of the chair. There's something of that in the turn of the hairline, the ear, the arch of the eyebrows, and the turn of the collar. Let me give you a nice story about closeness between father and son. There was a visitor to Cezanne's studio who noticed with alarm that little Paul was scribbling on top of his father's sketches and punching holes into one of his father's paintings. And when this was pointed out to Cezanne, well, doting father that he was, he said, "Let him be. He understands my work. He's letting light and air into it," is what Cezanne said. Okay, here is Hortense, Madame Cezanne. And this is a painting in our museum here, and I like to take my students to see this one too. And one thing I point out is how Cezanne hasn't done a straight-on kind of portrait, that her head is tilted, and how that gives the painting a certain feeling, a certain emotion. It becomes more introspective. And also notice that the eyes are different. One eye is larger than the other. In the past, when artists did portraits, they would often shade one side of the face and have the other side in light to give it interest, because that kind of straight-on symmetry isn't always very interesting. Cezanne hasn't used that shading thing, but by making one eye larger than the other, it brings this side of the face closer to us. So it's not only that the head is tilted, but moved over to one side. So if that makes sense to you, because of the way the eye pops out. You also notice that he hasn't outlined the lips. This is something Leonardo da Vinci figured out, and Cezanne is running with. Outlining lips would have been the traditional academic French way of painting, with this linear quality. And of course, by not outlining them, it gives them a kind of lifelike quality, like in the Mona Lisa. Is she about to smile, or is she just relaxing from a smile? So many of the portraits of Hortense are harsh and stern, but I wanted to show you a sweet one, because this is a little pencil drawing, and he's combined it with a flower, hydrangea, and her name was Hortense, in French, Hortensia, and in French, Hortensia means hydrangea. So that you can see this is a kind of visual pun. But most of his portraits are like this one, very harsh. And here's another reason, or another way in which the work of Cezanne is different from the Impressionists. You know that the Impressionists work quickly to capture a moment. Cezanne was a slow, methodical worker. And when he did portraits, it wasn't unusual of him to ask 40, 60, 80, even 100 sessions of a sitter. So this was a real trial of endurance. And I think it helps explain the look of the faces here, why they have a kind of mask-like quality, because when you work and rework, they lose that kind of spontaneity. In this one, I'm so intrigued, and you can see I'm not the only one. These are diagrams showing you this way that Cezanne has of putting everything kind of off kilter. So some things are straight up and some things are off kilter. And the overall effect is it gives this painting a kind of tension that draws us in. And a psychological portrait of Cezanne. There's a whole series of portraits of Madame Cezanne, Hortense, on these tilted chairs, like she's about to slide right out of the painting. But you can see his interest in form, the oval of her head, the oval of her arms, the emphasis on geometry. Some things are straight up and some things are off center, like you can see in the two diagrams. So the black line shows you the actual axis of the format. The green line shows you the axis of the figure. Here's another one of Hortense. And again, you can see the sort of mask-like quality. She's rather harsh, not only because of the way he's done her face, and notice how he's pared it down to a kind of oval, and we see the oval of her arms, the dark color of the dress, but the whole thing is warmed up by the fact that she's in this kind of garden and this combination of the blues and the warmer yellows here. Something I'd like to point out in this painting is look at all the places where Cezanne has let the canvas show through. We're not shocked by this because we're used to modern art, but in the 19th century, as you've seen with the paintings by Ingres, this wasn't done. And the question is, why did he do this? Was it because, again, he was a slow worker, kept several paintings going at once, and maybe intended to return to this later when he found just the right touch, just the right color? We don't know. There's a big debate in Cezanne's studies called finished, unfinished. But certainly what this does is it adds to the kind of modern look of these paintings. So they're kind of open-ended in a way that the Ingres paintings would never be. This is not a family member. This is a portrait of one of the servants from Cezanne's father's estate. Cezanne liked to paint the people he knew, people he was familiar with, and he did a whole series of portraits of the workers. In this painting, I'm interested in, see if you agree with me here, but a relationship I see between her and that still life arrangement over on the side. Now, what you're looking at is a coffee pot, an Italian-style coffee maker, which twists together in the middle. Notice how Cezanne has positioned it so that we're not distracted by the curve of the spout or the shape of the handle. We read it just as a cylinder, something in two parts, metallic, hollow, cool to the touch, hard. Well, jump over to her, and you can actually apply all those same adjectives to her. She too seems to twist together in the middle in two parts. And there's something about the blue coloring and the crispness of the folds that echoes that coffee pot. Sometimes I think of her like the Tin Woodman. Well, before I go any further with that, go back to the still life arrangement. So we've got the coffee pot. You can see the coffee cup, and notice the spoon standing straight up. Maybe the coffee was really strong, but I don't think so. I think here's an example of the kind of exaggeration, distortions that Cezanne would do. And in doing this, here anyway, telling us something about this woman. She looks to me like a no-nonsense gal. There's a certain physical strength that comes across and a certain force of character as well. What I'd like to do for you now is I've got a series of still life paintings, so you can see how his work evolves in that area. And this is really a great way of explaining his work. This was an area of great mastery for him. And when you think about it, you can understand why. Because when you paint a landscape, you have to find what you want to paint. You have to deal with weather. With portraiture, your sitter might squirm, twitch, change position. With still life, you decide what you want to paint and you set it up in the way you want. And so this gave Cezanne an opportunity to experiment. This kind of control led him to experiment with ideas about composition, the arrangement of the objects here. Now, I bet if you've ever taken an art class, they've told you not to do what Cezanne has done here. What has he done? Well, look, he's set up the objects in a kind of regular fashion, evenly spaced, moving from high to low. In art class, they always say, go for a kind of asymmetry. That's what's going to make it work, give it interest. Cezanne hasn't done that here, and yet it works. How? Why? Well, notice the wallpaper design again. Look at the way it touches on this pot here. In fact, there's a nice relationship between the design in the paper and the reflection on the pot. Wallpaper then moves up, comes down to the cup, moves up, comes down. And then we notice that all these objects sit on this white cloth. So the white cloth is a nice way of unifying the composition. When I show this painting in class, I often tell my students, and I probably should have asked you if you had paper and pencil handy, to do a really quick sketch of it. Nothing complicated, just as fast as they can to do a quick sketch. And after they've done their sketch, I say, turn your sketch upside down. Okay, you ready? Here's our painting. Here's the painting upside down. And my students, because they're here in X and they know the mountain over on the east side, they immediately say, oh, it looks like the mountain, La Montagne Sainte-Victoire. And it's not just coincidence. It has to do with Cezanne's interest in form. Look at the sculptural treatment he's given the drapery here. And a triangle, that's a classic way of organizing a composition. Something he uses here. And of course, later on, he finds this triangular shape in the mountain. This is the same green jar. In fact, let me jump ahead for a moment here. This is the green jar we just looked at. This is the one we're going to look at. And here's the real green jar in his studio, which you can visit here in X. This is actually a traditional Provençal olive pot. And he painted the same objects over and over again, and it's fun to see them in the studio. And it's fun to see also how every time he paints these objects, they look different. Look here. Here, it looks sort of shiny. We saw the reflection here, shiny glaze. And over here, the glaze looks sort of matte, mottled, and it's especially the mouth of the jar that's been emphasized. Oops, I have to go back. I would say the reason for the modifications here have to do with this decorative panel in the background. Look at the shapes here, the movement. It's this that sets the stage for everything else that happens in the painting. It's this that explains not only why this is the way it is, because it's a related shape, but why the bit of raffia on this ginger jar is standing straight up, because it echoes the shapes and movement. Why the design on the sugar bowl looks this way here, and you'll see in other paintings of the sugar bowl, the design is quite different. And I'd say it also, this panel also explains why the keyholes here are so prominent, because they're related shapes. And something else very important, follow one edge of the tabletop across to the other side. Okay, I'll try to do it with my cursor, staying in an even line, but what you'll see is they don't meet up. Something happens under the drapery here. It's as if that plate of fruit, it's so heavy, it's pushing down on the tabletop, which comes up in response. An idea I think we also have in these very dramatic starch folds of this drapery. Here's another kind of distortion. This is how Cezanne involves us. It always looks to me like this plate is going to slip right out of the painting and end up on our laps. So we're poised here, ready to catch this. You'll recognize some of the objects here, objects you'll see in the studio, the ginger jar again, the sugar bowl, but look at the design on the sugar bowl is different. There's a circle here, and then you start seeing all sorts of circles in this painting. But let me draw your attention to something else. This basket of fruit, very precariously placed on the back edge of the table, and yet notice it doesn't fall off. It doesn't fall off because it's held in place by some strange devices. Over on the right, there's a piece of furniture. We don't know what it is, but a leg comes in, touching the basket. And on the other side, notice the way the leg of the chair seems to reach out, just touching the basket. So it's bracketed in between those two things. And then you notice, for example, the size of this piece of fruit, like an anchor weighing the whole thing down. Cezanne's still life compositions are always so carefully composed. We have the feeling if we were to remove any piece of fruit here, what would happen? Well, boom, the whole thing would just come tumbling down. And did you check out the table edge again? I'll try to do this by staying in a straight line, but notice it still doesn't meet up. But more than that, look at all the different points of view, the changing eye levels. We're looking straight across to some objects. We're looking down into the ginger jar. Look at where the horizon line is, way up high. Here's one of the reasons why we call Cezanne the father of modern art. He gets rid of perspective, the system that's been around since the Renaissance. Cezanne realizes that perspective implies a fixed point of view. And he says, no, we're always moving around. We see things from different points of view. And that's what he's done here. He's combined multiple viewpoints in one painting. Here's a lovely one. With this one, I always think that, this is why Matisse got interested in Cezanne as well as Picasso. And I mentioned Matisse here because of the emphasis on design. It's very abstract in a certain way. You could read it as just 3 horizontal bands, or did you understand it as apples on the top of a chest? There's ambiguity in the reading because, look, some of the wallpaper design ends up down here to confuse us. Here's the latch of the chest, but notice the top of the chest, let's see if I can do this, it's not at a right angle with the front of the chest. So if I turn this here, it's like the top of the chest moves up, that's sitting on top of the bottom here. So one thing over another. And because the chest is cut off, cropped on the ends, well, this cropping flattens it. And speaking of cropping, look at what he's done with the plate over on the right-hand side. He's sliced it right in half. Very dramatic. And this is a painting I love. If you visit the studio, you will see that Cezanne, in addition to these sort of ordinary, everyday Provençal objects, he also owned 2 plaster casts, one of a Cupid figure, and the other one it's called the écorché, the flayed man. It was something that artists had so they could study musculature based on a Michelangelo. So you can see in his studio, he set up the Cupid surrounded by onions and apples. And then behind this Cupid figure, he has a background using his own paintings. 1, 2, 3. In fact, the third painting is a painting of that other plaster cast. And then there's some fun things that happen that we read this because there's a kind of diagonal that's moving back into space, but look at the size of this piece of fruit here. It's just as big as the one in the foreground. So there's this tension between depth and the flatness of the picture plane. And of course, he's positioned it so that it echoes the belly of the Cupid. And more than that, okay, look at the onion here. Notice how the onion becomes part of the painting behind it. And the same thing with the drapery here. Here's part of the drapery of the real still life, and it becomes part of the painted drapery in the painting behind it. In fact, if you think of like this painting in the background, this is 4 times removed from reality. This is a painting of a plaster cast after an original based on Michelangelo. So you can see that Cezanne here is playing with this idea about what is a painting? Is it on the surface? Is it in depth? Or is it the relationship between the two? Here's my last still life for you. And you can see this one is just jam-packed, loaded with stuff, rich patterns, richly colored. Look at the drapery here, very sculptural. It looks like it's made of the same stuff as these ceramic dishes. Notice how the arrangement of fruit here is echoed in the design on the pitcher. And notice how Cezanne has given us no reference to the surface this still life sits on, the table, for example, or the room it's set up in. So this is what, again, gives it this modern look, because it's ambiguous in terms of the space, because without these references, it looks flat. Okay, well, I'm hoping after that discussion, we can make better sense of the landscape work. In fact, my first landscape is a seascape. He's back in Lestat. Remember, this is where his mother has a little house, and he's working here. And I would say it's at this moment, 1878, that Cezanne has his epiphany moment, looking out to sea here. And speaking of the sea, look at the way he's painted it. Think of Monet or Renoir. They would have used lots of touches of the brush, lots of different colors to have brilliant shimmering effects, the reflections of light across the surface of the water. And for Cezanne, the water here is just a flat triangle of blue. In fact, you could say we've got those bands again. There's a band of texture, band of flat, band of texture, band of flat. This is Marseille on the far shore. Here's the Gulf of Marseille, and he's set up his easel in, again, this little fishing village called Lestat. And just one more, just another example. This time you can almost see the church on the top of the hill, which is part of the city of Marseille. But you can see he's not interested really in showing us or telling us anything very much about the city. So what Cezanne is doing is he's not reproducing what he sees. He's creating a painting based on the element he sees. He's taking liberties. This one also painted near Marseille in this little fishing village of Lestat, except now he's looking inland instead of out to sea. His attention focused on these man-made structures, juxtaposed with these natural forms, the rocky outcroppings. And again, look at how Mediterranean this looks, the way that the light picks out the forms and objects. And this is a medieval hilltop town, halfway between Aix and Marseille. He's fascinated here, like we all are when we visit Provence, the way these towns are clustered along the slopes of the hill with the church at the top. And you can see that the emphasis again on geometry and a kind of faceting. Even his trees here look like cubes. 1886 was a kind of turning point for Cezanne, because it's in 1886 he finally marries his partner Hortense. It's in 1886 that his father dies. So he moves into the family house, the Jazz du Buffon, with his mother and his sister, because Hortense, even though they've just married, they actually have been separated for a long time. She spends all her time up in Paris. Excuse me. She hates it down in Aix. And plus, for a long time, she was never welcome. So she and their son are up in Paris. And it's also at this time, there's a break with his best friend Zola, because Zola has written a book called L'Oeuvre, the Masterpiece. And it's the story of a kind of talented artist, but an artist who's unable to realize his genius and out of frustration commits suicide. And it was clearly based on Cezanne. And of course, Cezanne took this badly, as did all the Impressionists, because up until that point, Zola had been championing their work. So this marks a break. I put this in because this is in the White House collection. And you could see that Cezanne is interested in the form of the mountain and the layout of this village, that this is kind of unfolding like a fan in the structure of the village and in the structure of the mountain, the parallel structures. Not Cezanne. This is a painting by Georges Braque. Braque, Picasso were the founders, the developers of Cubism. And I think you can see how they took their cue from the few things I've shown you of Cezanne directly from him. And notice the title and date. This was done 2 years after Cezanne's death. Braque discovers Cezanne in a big retrospective put together in Paris of his work. And Braque, so fascinated by Cezanne's work, thought that, well, maybe I'll get a better handle on this if I go south. And that's where he produces this painting based on the one I showed you by Cezanne. In fact, a whole art colony grows up in Lestock because of Cezanne's presence. Picasso, Matisse, Braque, Derain, many artists passed through Lestock. Cezanne once wrote in a letter to a younger artist, he said, his advice was, treat nature in terms of the cone, the sphere, the cylinder. There's that idea of paring everything down into basic geometric shapes. In this painting, we see he's got a cylinder. This is actually a pigeon coop. In the old days, they used to raise pigeons for food. This is typically Provençal with a red tile roof and a pretty band of glazed tiles, which is there to keep the foxes out of the coop because they would slip on the tiles. This pigeon coop belonged to Cezanne's sister and her husband, who had a farm over on the west side of Aix. Cezanne liked to go there to work because it was quiet, it was private. He hated to be watched while he worked and hated to be interrupted. And it's from here he had a wonderful view. So he's up high on the west side of Aix, looking over the valley in which Aix sits. Of course, the city's grown up quite a bit since Cezanne's day. We see the mountain on the far side. And this, doesn't it look like a Roman aqueduct? In fact, it's a train bridge. But I think one of the reasons we want to read it that way has to do with the nature of this landscape. Again, there's something Mediterranean. By Mediterranean, I mean classical. By classical, well, look again at the emphasis on verticals and horizontals. And we've been talking about ambiguity. This is fun. This looks like a road in the distance. But if you cover that up and you focus just on this part, you see you can read it as a branch of the tree. Look what happens with the viaduct. Once it passes behind the tree, on the other side, it pops forward with a bit of foliage, like a branch. When Cezanne was asked to explain his work, he'd actually use a gesture. He'd take his hands like this, bring them together and mesh them, and he'd say, everything in a painting needs to be related to everything else. Everything has to hang together, hold together, like the pieces of a puzzle. And I think you see that here in the way he weaves together foreground, background, horizontals, verticals, cool colors, warm colors. This is another painting from the same series from his sister's farm. Now he's got the mountain more in central position. I love the way this tree, which is in the foreground, how the branch moves down and just seems to sweep the top of the mountain in the distance. So there's that weaving again. Notice how there's a tree on the other side, but we don't see it. But the way the branch moves in and wonderfully follows the contours of the horizon line here. And you can see what he's doing here, paring down to essences. But this mountain is not an afterthought, not something far away in the distance. We feel like we can reach out and touch it. And look how different it is from Renoir's version, who came down to visit Cezanne in the south of France. Renoir's is, the mountain's far away. And the whole thing is sort of that feathery, impressionistic touch. Not the massive sculptural presence we see in the Cezanne. Cezanne did a series of paintings on the theme of the card players. The workers on his father's estate would get together and relax and play cards. And he did, as you know, a series of the workers, and he combined all these paintings in the synthetic group of the card players. So here they are with a game board, their cards. We see a young boy looking on and an older man looking on. In fact, this subject is a subject that's been around for a long time in art. It's about playing cards. It's about chance, destiny, fate, the hand we're dealt. And often in these paintings, the young boy doesn't play because he doesn't yet know the rules of the game, and the older man has stepped back from the game. But look what Cezanne does with this as we move through this series. He sort of takes away the narrative, the anecdotal quality. The young boy is gone, the game board is gone. And in the final paintings in this series, and on the right you have an example, we have just two players, almost like mirror images of each other. And notice even their cards are blank. And instead of everybody watching everybody else to try and figure out what they have in their hand, their gaze is toward inward, so that the painting is a kind of meditation. Again, with students, I often tell them, or I often ask, which of these two figures do you think is winning? And then they start noticing slight differences. So one figure is a little wider, one's a little taller. I don't really know which one is winning, but there are sort of slight differences in the figures. Later on in his life, Cezanne he switches from the west side of X to the east side of X. So now he's just under the mountain. He does a series of paintings called the Chateau Noir, which means the black chateau. And here it is. It was so called not because it was black in color, but because of the strange look of the place. This was the eccentric project of its builder, built in the 19th century, but with Gothic-shaped windows, never finished, in ruin from day one. And that's probably how it got its name. In fact, there were rumors circulating about how the owner was in league with the devil, involved with experiments in alchemy. And Cezanne liked all this. He was reading Edgar Allan Poe at the time, wanted to buy the property, but the owner refused to sell. And finally, they came to this arrangement where Cezanne rented a small room here where he would keep his supplies. So he would leave town and then come out and paint. But speaking of Edgar Allan Poe, look at this sort of spooky Gothic feel here. These trees are kind of spiky, and it's almost like a hole ripped in a barbed wire fence, and then the house itself seems to be peering out at us like a face. Another one done from around the property, and you can see that same interest in juxtaposing geometric man-made forms. This is a millstone, stone blocks. The mill was never finished either, with the tangle of the underbrush behind. And same idea, I think, had to do with his interest in working in a quarry. This was a quarry first exploited by the Romans. Many of the buildings in X that are from the 17th and 18th century have this kind of warm yellow color. But in the 19th century, they were no longer using this quarry, and this is where Cezanne worked. And if you looked at this painting without knowing that story, you might wonder what this strange geometric shape is. So again, we have these, this combination of the foliage. In fact, maybe these plants sort of nature taking this quarry back over. And I'm almost at the end now. I hope you're holding up okay. At the end of his life, two things kept Cezanne busy. One was a final series of view of the mountain, this time from the north side of X. And here's an example. And you can see how this moves towards abstraction. We have just the sky, the mountain, the field. Notice that the colors aren't restricted to any one of those zones, so that some of the blue from the sky is down in the field, the green from the field is up in the sky. And the effect here, well, it's like a patchwork quilt. We have this kind of all over patterning. So it has this kind of flatness once again. And here's a detail of that painting. So you see the kind of patchwork brushstrokes. So there isn't specific information about trees, houses. It's very open-ended. Two more examples. And in fact, here again is an example of the finished, unfinished question. And Picasso said of this painting, and in fact, Renoir echoed this as well. He said, the thing with Cezanne is all he has to put down is 3 strokes and the painting's already there. That it's just a question of the degree of finish. And I like that quote because I think that's exactly right. And you could see in this painting on the right the way Cezanne works. He doesn't paint the mountain first, and then the field, or vice versa, and then the sky. He works all over the canvas at once, building. Here is his studio, if you get to come to X. And of course, his studio he had built for himself at the end of his life. So he leaves this studio and goes up the hill to paint. And here are where the objects are that I showed you. And finally, the other thing that kept him busy at the end of his life was a series of very large paintings on this theme, once again, of the bathers. And actually, unlike everything else where he keeps paring down to essences, these paintings get bigger and bigger and bigger and more filled with figures. Look at these figures. This theme of the bathers, Cezanne wasn't the only one to do it, but usually it's about sensuality, a nude female figure in nature. But there's nothing very sexy about these figures. In fact, they're sort of androgynous. And one art historian has actually quipped that the trees in these paintings are sexier than the girls. And if these figures remind you of Picasso, well, that's exactly right. This is where Picasso got all his ideas from. And you can see once again Cezanne's interest in form. Look at the way he's composed this scene. We have 2 triangular groups of figures, and they're integrated into a larger triangle formed by the trees. Here he is in front of 2 other examples of these late bather paintings. And oh yeah, my next to last slide. I mentioned that nobody knew very much about Cezanne because he kind of leaves Paris. He's working in the South, and there are even rumors that he's no longer alive, but he was very much alive and hard at work. A few artists seek him out at the end of his life. One was an artist by the name of Maurice Denis. And Maurice Denis made a very famous statement. I'll read it out to you. This is Denis' painting of visiting Cezanne. Here's the canvas that Cezanne's working on and his view of the mountain. And Denis says, remember that a picture, before being a battle horse, a female nude, or some sort of anecdote, is essentially a flat surface covered with colors assembled in a certain order. So this is this very modern idea that what counts is not what's represented, but how it works as a painting, the colors and the shapes on the surface. And my very last slide is Picasso, who was anything but a modest man, came to Aix and bought a chateau. And he said, Cezanne is the father of us all. And when he bought this property near Aix, he said, I live at Cezanne's place. And he never painted the mountain while he was here. He was here from about 1958 to 1962. And just with a great anecdote at the to finish up with, when he buys this property, he calls up his dealer to announce the news. And the conversation went something like this. Picasso says, guess what? Dealer says what? Picasso says, I just bought the mountain Sainte Victoire. And the dealer goes, oh, okay, really? Which one? Because the dealer just assumed that Picasso had bought another one of Cezanne's paintings of the mountain. And then Picasso answers, the original. Well, thank you very much for your patience. I'm sorry if I ran just a little over time, but I'm happy to answer any questions. So let me stop my slide share and just to see if you've written anything in the chat. And if you'd like, as I said, to unmute and ask me a question directly, sure, that'd be great.
Thank you, Pamela. That was fun and fascinating. So if anybody has any questions, please raise your hand and unmute.
Have any of you had the chance to visit Aix-en-Provence?
No.
Yes, many times.
I know Patty has. Yeah.
I lived there for 2 years. So.
Yeah. So, did I make any of this up, Patty?
No, you did not. What I love, I just want to share one thing that.
Sure.
From my experience with you as our professor, there were a few paintings in there I recognized because you took us out on a field trip to see the pigeon coop, and you took the photographs of Cezanne's work and showed us the actual places. And to me, that was so enriching. And so, you know, I've never forgotten that, seeing the actual place where he stood to paint and see the imagery.
And I hope you all can do that, because that's right. It adds another dimension, another level of understanding when you can see the sights, appreciate the quality of light, the climate. And yes, I hope you all get to do this. Yes, go ahead. I see there's another question.
I'm just wondering whether Cezanne ever kept notebooks. I mean, did he paint in watercolor and sketch before he did his oil paintings?
Yes, he did a lot of watercolor work. He did beautiful watercolors. And in fact, the way he worked for the most part is he hiked. These artists were all great hikers. So he would walk around the countryside. And of course, while he was walking around, he goes, and same for Van Gogh, he'd go, oh, that's something. And he would come back to it to do a watercolors. The one difference for both Cezanne and Van Gogh, unlike the traditional way artists work, artists traditionally would do a tree and then come back to their studio and go, okay, I'll use the tree from that sketch here, and I'll use the bush from that sketch here and the rock there, and then compose a painting in a kind of synthetic way. But Cezanne would do watercolors, which are pretty much finished works. And then the oil paintings, so in other words, the watercolors were not preparatory studies. They were not a lead up to the paintings. They were in one way, because of course he's thinking about all these issues, but the paintings were not based on the watercolors. Maybe that's what I mean. And he also did some wonderful drawings. And you can also see, I think, in his oil paintings that watercolor was important to him, because the paintings often looked like watercolors. And one thing about watercolors is you want the whiteness of the paper to help unify the painting, because of course the paintings are the paint is transparent. And we see that in Cezanne's painting. And maybe you can even make the case that explains the kind of unfinished look, that it has that connection with the watercolor as well.
My question is, you revealed so much about what was in Cezanne's mind, the geometry, what he was trying to accomplish with the paintings. And I wonder how much of that you learned from him. Did he write about his painting? Did he write about what he was trying to accomplish, or is this all inferred?
Yeah, excellent question. And here's something I will say before I answer your question. I think, like we'll see next time, I think people respond to Van Gogh more immediately than they do to Cezanne. And that's why these artists are such an interesting comparison, because Van Gogh wears his heart on his sleeve. You look at his painting, you know what he was thinking, you know what he was feeling. Whereas Cezanne, I think you've seen, is a much more cerebral artist. And he's harder to sort of get into. Once you get into, you see that it's wonderfully rich. And of course, I'm trying to help you find a way in. And that's when I talk about form, that for Vincent van Gogh, I'd say his response to the South is in terms of color. As a Northerner coming south, it's color. For Van Gogh, For Cezanne, it's not that. It's about form. Again, Provence has much more to do with Italy and Greece than it does with northern France. So it makes sense to me that this interest in sculpture is part of who he is. But I see that in his work, and he also talks about it to a certain extent. So there's both those things, and I'm trying to help you find a way in to his painting. So I emphasize form in particular, as I will emphasize color in particular for Van Gogh. And he does talk about Cezanne, about his interest in form. For example, when I mentioned that letter where he says, treat nature in terms of the cone, the sphere, the cylinder. That certainly shows his interest in paring down. And that's what modern artists do, is they pare down to essentials. In the old days, you would start with some sort of armature, and then you'd flesh out. Think of like in the back of comic books, the way they teach you to draw a cat, a circle, an oval, and then 2 triangles for the ears. And then, so you keep adding on. But in modern artists, it's about paring down to essentials. And of course, one thing about another final little difference is we know so much about Van Gogh because he wrote so much about his work and his life and what he was thinking. And Cezanne was cagier. He was afraid, actually, that other artists would steal his petite sensation, his little sensation, because Gauguin started to work in a Cezanne way, and he didn't like that. So he didn't write to the same extent that Van Gogh did, for example. So some of this is my interpretation, but I do believe it's based on some things that he said and based on the work. Maybe there's something else I could add to that, but it's an excellent question, your question about the form. And also, finally, I'll say that sometimes when you talk about work or artwork, and this happens to me, I think it takes the soul, the mystery out of painting sometimes. And I'm sure Cezanne never thought, okay, time for a triangle. So he didn't think that way. So I know this analytical approach is kind of dry, and that's not the way he worked. But I do think it's an important part of his process, yes.
Thanks.
Okay.
When you were talking about his studio, I just wanted to share with everybody that when you go there today, they put real onions and real peaches as if the artist is actually still there and working. Mm. So that was always a very special touch to me. Mm. And in the town of Aix-en-Provence, they have the gold pieds, the little footprints that you can follow Cezanne's route by looking for these little gold footprints through the whole town. And it makes me laugh because the history of the town was they hated Cezanne when he was actually there working. And they used to make fun of him and spit on him and just treat him horribly. But now, of course, they realized who they had living there. And they've made a very good impression now on many visitors with the little route to Cezanne and going up to the studio and out to Mont Saint-Victoire. And they've done a great job with that. But thank you, Pamela. That was wonderful. It was really rejuvenated me.
Oh, good. Thank you. And I just a little aside, not only do they have apples and onions in his studio, but they let them rot. And they do this for authenticity because Cezanne was such a slow worker. And even Cezanne sometimes would have to replace fruit with artificial fruit so that he could continue working.
Yeah. But thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Pamela. And I look forward to seeing everybody here again next week.
Absolutely. When we'll talk about Van Gogh then. Thank you so much for joining me. And I look forward to seeing you then next Thursday for Van Gogh. Great.
Au revoir. Au revoir, madame.
Au revoir. Au revoir, à bientôt. À jeudi prochain.
D'accord. Bonne santé.